Hi, everybody. I'm Darren Shou. I'm the CTO of NortonLifeLock, and today I'm joined here by members of our research labs. We have Dr. Saurabh Shintre, we have Dr. Petros Efstathopoulos, and we have Daniel Katz as well here. So welcome, everybody. Where I wanted to start off the conversation with you all today was really kind of at the high level. What is disinformation? What is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Because I think they're conflated, but are in many ways, the same. How do we distinguish between the two?
Disinformation is usually deliberate, right? When we think of disinformation, we think of nation states, usually other bad actors, deliberately trying to disinform people, make them think that something is true, which is really not. Misinformation is your garden variety falsehoods or urban legends that just spread in a community, and the people that spread them generally don't know that these things are untrue.
I'm glad you brought that up about kind of the intent, but also it sounds like, is there an element of context here?
There definitely is, because disinformation, you're spreading it to people that maybe you don't know. You're spreading it widely. Misinformation a lot of the time is personal. There are these half-repeated truths to people in your social network, so they spread much more locally. And that's really the danger with misinformation in particular, because in that case, misinformation is spread in a local community among trusted members, and so it gains traction in this way. And in that way, it can be much more insidious. Whereas it's a little bit easier to fight disinformation because sometimes, not always, you can figure out, oh, I heard it from this source. And then if it turns out that the source is incredible, you can start uprooting these beliefs. The actors that spread disinformation, they're getting really smart, and they figured out that misinformation has this kind of community spread. They're now trying to use more of this misinformation community model to spread it locally among peer-to-peer connections so that you can't really trace it back to what the original source is. It just becomes this ambient truth or ambient narrative that's floating around a community.
Is that like hiding in plain sight? I mean, is it basically hiding the bad and the good?
Think about it like a shell game, right? The disinformation starts in a certain shell, but then when you mix it up, you don't know where it's come from. And so when you say, oh, I think it came from here, you look underneath, that's not where really it came from. Really, the ball is now in every shell in that analogy.
So, one of the things I also wonder about, be interesting to get your guys' points on, is if people start to believe this false information that they're accessing, and even if they're told that it's false information, does that impact, maybe make people doubt accurate information that actually is accurate, right? How are our perceptions colored by this? How is it affecting our thinking and our behaviors?
I think one of the goals of disinformation campaigns is to muddy the waters. So especially when you talk about issues regarding elections or anything where a lot of people are participating and people's opinions matter, in that case, if you can put in a couple of actors that are just going to give you maybe advice that is not popularly believed to be true, but if you can make enough people believe, then a lot of people will believe the bad advice. But I think a lot of people also end up thinking that, hey, maybe we just don't know the facts about it. And maybe there is something more that needs to be studied. And in that case, when experts try to rectify this problem and they try to go and say, hey, this is the true information, people just don't believe it anymore because they cannot necessarily understand where this information is coming from. So muddying the waters is definitely one of the key components of the modern disinformation age.
One of the things that recent research has showed is that when people don't have a clear, coherent narrative to latch onto, they actually look for alternative narratives. So a lot of the social media companies now are putting a lot of effort into trying to get high quality information out about current events, because they found that in the absence of that high quality information, it allows misinformation to spread more rapidly. And so if you can counteract and create a narrative early, both for true and false information, it makes that narrative sticky in a sense. And so later on, it's much harder to counteract that narrative, even if that narrative is not true.
And because more of the world is virtual, does that have a big impact on how this is all playing out?
Being virtual creates a certain, or not just being virtual and also going through a pandemic creates a certain sense of isolation and maybe disconnect from communities and other people who would maybe balance out a little bit the beliefs and the thoughts that each person has. And therefore, when you're trapped in a bubble where your perception of the world is largely affected or influenced by social media or regular media for that matter, it's very easy to not only have skewed opinions, but maybe even be manipulated or scammed in many cases, right? We've seen that all these kinds of misleading information leads to emotions like, fear, uncertainty, and so on, that can very much be taken advantage of. So it creates opportunities for additional criminal activity. So the problem in this last year, and generally as life becoming more and more digital, is that we need to protect the users not only from the primary source of threat, to put it in for lack of a better word, as I said, this kind of expanded attack surface, but also protect users from the secondary effects of that. So if fear and anxiety and uncertainty thrives because of what's happening with disinformation and misinformation, all the secondary effects come in, and then you see scams rising, you see other kinds of fraud. So the problem at that point becomes multidimensional.
I think to build on what Petros was saying, there was a New York Times study that showed that social media use is dramatically up during the pandemic. And so that's certainly part of it. But I think another part of it is the nature of communication has changed. So as you guys may remember, and this may highlight our age here, do you remember those serial forward emails that you would get from your conspiracy theory uncle? And it would say forward, forward, forward.
Yeah, I got one last night. Absolutely.
I remember those as well, and I don't see them much anymore. But when you would see that, that would be an instant red flag that what you're about to read is going to be something really insane. But it was also one way that information would spread in the early internet. But there was kind of a cap on how far that would go and how trustworthy that looked. Whereas now what we're seeing is that same crazy uncle who would before do forward might send you a WhatsApp message or post to your Facebook or Instagram with that same content, but suddenly it's going out to not just the handful of people in the two field, but maybe hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people. And that really changes the speed at which disinformation travels. And as we've discussed, a lot more people spending time on social media also affects this. I mean, how often do you check your email versus how often are you on TikTok or Instagram?
Yeah, Daniel, it reminds me of that old Mark Twain saying, a lie can travel halfway around the world and back. By the time the truth gets done lacing up its shoes. The funny thing about that quote is I've heard that in and of itself is not correctly attributed, and it wasn't Mark Twain. It could have been, Swift. It could have been, I mean, Churchill obviously said it quite a bit. So it's interesting just how things, when they create a response, get transmitted with zeal, with fervor, and they accelerate around. And I think, like you said, technology really is the fuel for that acceleration. Era, what are the predictions for how disinformation might continue to evolve?
But one trend that I am particularly certain about is that the quality of disinformation and impersonation or sort of fake personalities would even grow further and further because of the quality of, like, first of all, there's more and more data available about people online, which helps,
And what are we talking about, sir? Are we talking about deep fakes? Are we talking about synthetics? What are we,
yeah, we're talking about deep
me
fakes
what
and
that is.
synthetic video, audio, and even synthetic text now with the help of text generators like GPT-3. So we have, like, the quality of, you might have heard in the news about these new Tom Cruise deep fakes, which were very popular on TikTok, which look really good quality. And this is really going to be the trend. I've worked in this field, and
but I got to ask you a quick question for everybody in the audience that doesn't know what GPT-3 is.
Right.
What is it? Is it just a tool that makes this easy? Is it free to everybody? Is it expensive? How hard is it these days to create an impersonation?
Right. I mean, a lot of these technologies are available for free, even though there are almost little to no control around who gets access to that. So even if the companies who make it don't make it accessible to everybody, it's not very hard to impersonate or to come up with, an roughly equivalent solution. So for the most part, technologies that generate deep fakes or, deep text or deep audio is available for anyone to use.
And when you say that, like deep audio, that is, you could train on my voice from recordings I've made or postings on Insta that I've done. And then you could type in whatever you want me to say and it would generate something that sounds like me saying it, right? Is that what I understand to be true?
Yeah, exactly. And we have seen the cases, I think 2 years ago, of a bunch of companies being defrauded of a lot of money because of fake calls that sounded like the CEO and that made employees
transfer $1 million to this account, or otherwise we're going to lose it
immediately, or something bad will happen, and then the employee didn't really question that, hey, this sounds like the CEO, this seems like really urgent, and within that moment they were not able to make the decision that, hey, this could be a scam or this could be a fake. But those technologies are only getting better. They're only getting more and more accessible to people because, like, now they have good APIs that even somebody who doesn't fully understand how advanced machine learning algorithms work can get away and use those techniques. They don't require big computers like they used to require, like 20 years ago, when only like Star Wars studios were the ones who were able to do these kinds of fakes. So that is one trend that definitely is clear.
Who's responsible for it? Is it an individual responsibility? Is it a platform responsibility? Is it a protection that we need to deliver? Can you tell me a little bit about who's responsible for really handling this problem, this growing problem?
The real answer is we're all responsible. Every single one of us, the companies and the individuals and the technologists and the journalists, every single person is responsible for the spread of disinformation. One idea here is there has been work on how to prevent people from keeping disinformation, beliefs that come from disinformation. So for example, if you have a parent who is a skeptic of vaccines, there's some resources designed to help you convince them that that vaccines are actually useful. And the most statistically likely intervention is if their trusted relative or friend intervenes with them and talks with them. It's much less impactful if a platform or a technologist or a journalist intervenes. And so in that sense—
So not just what's being said, but who's saying it.
Exactly. And so in that sense, it's our collective responsibility. It's our responsibility to help our parents, help our friends, navigate through this world and try to dispel some beliefs which may not be correct.
In software security, we are familiar with this concept of 0 days. So 0 days are those vulnerabilities that are known to the attacker about some weaknesses in the system that are not known to the maker of the system, right? And it's very common to exploit these kinds of 0 days. And within this area of deepfakes, disinformation, and things like that, we now have this new idea of human 0 days. So these are weaknesses in our rationality that people have been aware of for a long time. Like, scammers and tricksters have been using, magicians have been using these kinds of weaknesses in our systems for a very long time. With tech, it just becomes much easier to exploit them at a larger scale, but the principles still remain the same. And this is something that we have seen with deepfake detection. There have been research that I I'm not able to point to right now, but which says that the people's efficacy in detecting whether a certain video is a deepfake or not increases when they spend more and more time looking at that image. So if you're asked to make a decision very quickly, you are going to get it wrong. But if you spend more and more time looking and analyzing the situation, you would be able to see that there are some problems here. Or that if you hear, we always say that if somebody says something that is too good to be true, right? If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So if you're hearing something that is just amplifying your own beliefs and it just seems too right, too comfortable, then you should be suspicious of that. And you can do that when you spend a little more time sort of critically analyzing what the situation is. And the attackers are also aware of that. And therefore, for example, the example I gave you about the CEO, fake CEO calling the employee, they create situations in which either they cause an emotional response to you because of like what they're saying, or is it like a stress response based on like, you need to do it right now, or hey, your kid is in some kind of danger. And in those kinds of moments, we are very stressed and our ability to guard us against any kinds of attacks goes down. And those are the moments in which deepfake, misinformation, and those kinds of things exploit. So this is something that we can be aware of.
So you're talking about these human 0 days, and I like that phrase there in the sense that it sounds like one way we can combat that is by slowing things down and pausing, really taking time to critically think about what the information we're being presented. I mean, if you think about it from an information theoretic standpoint of view, we are always consumers of information. We're always taking in these signals. And if you're taking in signals all the time, but you don't give it time to process the signals, right? Process the information, how can we? Of course, the human 0 day, I think, is that we constantly want to multitask. We constantly want to consume as much and process faster and faster. But if this threat of disinformation is growing, we may have to build in safeguards in ourselves, right? In the I don't know if you'd call it sort of a human operating system to slow down and make sure we don't miss that.
What has been one of the guiding principles is not only to understand and detect the threats, but primarily enable people to make the right decision. This goes back to what Daniel was saying, that solving disinformation is on all of us, right? The problem. And we don't only have to help our social circle understand what might be the impact of disinformation, as he was suggesting, but most of all, we need to help our own selves. So we need to have the right tools, the right elements, or the right pieces of technology that will help us make these right decisions, at least until we learn how to become a little bit better at doing this on our own. One such example is the work that Daniel has done in collaboration with other people in the labs around disinformation on Twitter, for instance, right? So we know that there are what we call sock puppet accounts, in other words, accounts that are not real people, that they're just perpetuate false facts and drive campaigns.
Right.
So what we did there, can we block them? Not necessarily. Sometimes, you cut one head and two spawn, out of that. But what we can do is annotate the feed of a user and tell them, listen, this account is fishy. Maybe you don't want to really pay too much attention. Or if you do read the account, just be aware. And that awareness is what will enable people to make what's right decisions. Right?
So it sounds like what you're saying is you can arm the consumer, anybody, with kind of like an X-ray vision to tell what's what, right? Is it fake, or is it a human? Is it not, right? Is that what you're saying?
Roughly, yes. It's basically giving enough context, offering enough context that they can understand, such that they can decide, for instance, if this is some account or some piece of news that I would pay attention to or follow or whatnot.
And kind of to Daniel's earlier example of the uncle trying to trick me versus, being convinced of it by a trusted partner. When I'm online, it's hard to tell whether I trust. If I know, if I'm interacting with you, Petros, online, and I hear something, I might really trust it. But if I'm just getting it through another source and I really don't know that, it's not like in the real world where I can easily say, hey, is this flesh and blood? Is this someone in my community? Is this someone who is presenting information in context? What I'm hearing you say is it's not just the content we have to analyze, but also a myriad of facets of the context as well.
The little things can sometimes be the most impactful. Just little changes. So let me give you two that I really love. One is recently WhatsApp created a limit that you can only forward a piece of content to 5 people. Is that technologically complex? No, extremely simple. But the impact that it had was enormous in limiting the rate of spread of disinformation. And another example is on TikTok. They have these interventions where if you've been scrolling for what it perceives as too long, it will show you a message that just says, listen, you should go outside, get off this platform.
Is it like the equivalent of social media distancing?
Yeah.
Stuff from social media.
Social media distancing.
Social media distancing, I love it. Yeah, so we have these interventions are very effective, and these go to some really fundamental, deep questions, but they're not technologically complex. And so you may wonder, why don't platforms adopt more of these? And unfortunately, all the social media companies are balancing these two fundamental forces, right? On the one hand, you have the amount of disinformation that's being spread on the site, but on the other hand, every second that you're not sharing content that you're not spending on the site is revenue that they lose, because that's how they make money. And I fear that unless you are able to get in that contradiction, that you're able to address that contradiction, then you're going to have a really tough time dealing with this problem.
What you're saying is human in the loop solution, right? You give them the tools, we empower the user. And what I heard also from Petros is we give them the context, and we're not making a decision. No tool is out there trying to make the decision for the individual, but you want to arm the consumer of the information so that they're in the best possible position to make a decision that benefits them the best for their concern and for their interests, right? I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Obviously, we could keep going on about this, but I want to thank you, Saurabh, thank you, Petros, thank you, Daniel. This has been great talking about the problem of what is disinformation, why should people care, what some of the predictions are for it, and it sounds like we have some hope about how we can actually combat it and really be an ally to people to live their lives online without fear of disinformation going forward. So really, thank you all.
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.